My name is Jane Weitzman, and I have the honor of chairing JDC's Archive Committee. I'm delighted to welcome you to this public lecture sponsored by the JDC Archives in the context of the Ruth and David Musher JDC Archives Regional Fellowship Program. The Regional Fellowship was established with a generous gift from Ruth and David Musher, those wonderful people who are supporters of JDC, who have deep roots in the American Jewish community, as well as a long-time commitment to Jewish education and academic research and scholarship. The goal of the fellowship is to enable scholars engaged in graduate level, postdoctoral, or independent research to conduct research focused on Israel and North African Jewish communities in the JDC archives. In addition to the JDC Regional Archives Fellowship, Ruth and David Musher have also sponsored the Ruth and David Musher Fellowship, and I really want to extend my deepest thanks to both of them who are with us today for their wonderful generosity. The JDC Archives, which houses the records of JDC since its creation 105 years ago, is one of the most important repositories in the world for the study of modern Jewish history. Visiting scholars from around the world utilize our unique offerings for their research, as do publishers, journalists, family researchers, curators, filmmakers, and you name it, all kinds of people who are looking to do research. I invite you to visit our wonderful website, archives.jdc.org, and to see the online exhibits, peruse our photo collection, use our names index, and research in our online text collections. I would now like to call on Ruth Musher, who will introduce our speaker today, Lauren Henry, who is the recipient of the JDC Archives Regional Fellowship for 2019. Our format is that our guest speaker will talk for about 45 minutes, and we will then entertain questions. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for being here. It looks like a wonderful group. Lauren Henry is a distinguished Ohio State University doctoral candidate in modern European Jewish history with a special interest in France. Her bachelor's degree is from Yale University. As a graduate student and a Susan Huntington Dean's Fellow, Ms. Henry has presented her work at conferences, taught class at university classes, and helped to lead an undergraduate study abroad course on World War II. During the 2018-19 academic year, she served as a visiting history department instructor at Kenyon College in Ohio. In addition, Ms. Henry now serves as the managing editor of an online blog published by the history departments of Miami and Ohio State Universities. The blog's name is Origins, Current Events in Historical Perspectives. Also interesting to note, prior to her academic career, Ms. Henry was an assistant editor at Marvel Comics and a pop culture freelance writer online. Lauren Henry's PhD project traces the historical ties between the Jews of Alsace and Algeria during World War II, the 1940s, 30s, 40s, and then after the Algerian War of Independence, the 1960s. First, the relationship of Alsatian Jews fleeing to Algeria, where both groups lived together closely, and then, 2 decades later, the migration of these Algerian Jews to France, where Jews from Alsace who migrated there during World War II welcomed them, and the consequences of these movements. As the 2019 Ruth and David Musher JDC Archives Regional Fellow, Ms. Henry researched the archives to learn how the JDC helped to facilitate connections between these Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities, which today make up important parts of the French Jewish population, which is the third largest Jewish population in the world. It is now my pleasure to invite Ms. Henry to the podium to speak to us on this fascinating topic, the JDC and the Jews of Alsace and Algeria, 1939, or is it 36? 39 to 1963.
Well,
62.
We'll see how far we can get.
Great. Well.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming today. I'd like to begin by expressing my appreciation to Ruth and David Mosher, whose generous support has made my research possible. I'm grateful as well to Jane for the lovely introduction, as well as to Isabel Rohr and all of the people I've met at the JDC for their help and guidance. On May 18, 1962, the Bulletin de nos Communautés, Bulletin of Our Communities, the bi-weekly chronicle of Jewish life in eastern France, devoted its front page to the acute crisis facing the Jewish community of Algeria. After nearly 8 years of brutal conflict between the French government and the Pro-Independence National Liberation Front, or FLN as I'll refer to it throughout this talk, both sides had signed a ceasefire agreement in March, recognizing Algerian sovereignty and laying out the process of decolonization. Throughout the war, the 140,000-strong Jewish population of Algeria had found its traditional intermediary position between the European settler minority and the Arab Muslim majority increasingly untenable. As Algerian independence loomed, Algerian Jews faced an agonizing choice: to remain in Algeria where they felt increasingly unwelcome, unsafe, and vulnerable, or to abandon the land where their roots stretch back more than 2,000 years. By the time this article appeared, as published by Dr. Joseph Weil, president of one of Alsace's 2 regional consistories, or governing bodies, thousands of Algerian Jews had already begun to depart for France. Weil described the scene in gripping terms. Once again, infants and children, along with their mothers, are the victims of political havoc, of wanton hatred, of cruel passions that destroy their futures. Once more, tragedy chokes the future of innocent and joyful laughter in its steel snare. Intolerance sows terror within confident and open eyes. Once again, the pitiful phenomenon of displaced persons occurs as a result of upheaval, flight, expulsion, hiding places, anxiety, degradations, misery, murder, and the separation and dispersion of families. Between 1962 and 1965, 120,000 Algerian Jews would arrive in France, fundamentally transforming the geography, demographics, and practices of French Jewry forever. The exodus of Algerian Jews echoes the choices of other groups during the same period, both in Algeria and throughout the region. Algerian Jews formed only one component of a larger migratory exodus at the end of the Algerian War. Nearly the entire population of Algeria, many of whom could trace their origins back to the onset of French colonization in 1830, left for France. Between 1962 and 1965, over 1 million individuals of European descent, or pieds noirs, migrated to the metropole. Likewise, some 200,000 Haqqis, or Muslim Algerian soldiers who had fought in the French army, also fled to France to avoid retribution from the new Algerian state. Scholars of French decolonization have often examined the Algerian Jewish community within this broader context to understand how their experiences compared with other groups who migrated to France at this time. It is alternatively possible to see the migration of Algerian Jews as part of a larger regional exodus of Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews. The roughly 3 decades following the founding of the State of Israel in 1948 and the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution in 1979 witnessed the dissolution of Jewish communities throughout the Middle East and North Africa. During the period, over 850,000 Jews left their homes, all too often driven out by the explicitly anti-Semitic policies of the newly independent countries where their ancestors had lived for centuries. The fact that the vast majority of Algerian Jews chose France rather than Israel, unlike their co-religionists in other Arab states, has also engendered a large amount of research regarding the nature of political and religious identity among Algerian Jews. Writing in Strasbourg in May 1962, however, Weil drew an altogether different comparison to underscore the plight of Algerian Jews, the Holocaust. Less than 20 years after the Warsaw and Vilno ghettos, after the slaughterhouses and crematoriums of Auschwitz, Dobor, and Treblinka, hundreds of thousands of people are again treated like cattle, he wrote. One would think oneself back in those dreadful dark years, hiding in the corners of houses, lying in ambush at the turn of the roads, with the evil shadow of Nazi henchmen rising up from the stories of refugees. The nightmares of which we believed ourselves to be delivered haunts our nights. This impulse to compare the crisis facing Algeria's Jews with World War II makes sense on several levels. The massive influx of so-called rapatriés, or repatriates, from Algeria to France represented the largest wave of population displacement since the fall of France in 1940. No observer who had lived through that event could fail to appreciate the visual parallels between the exodus of French citizens from Algeria in 1962 and the mass flight of Belgian, French, and Luxembourgish civilians fleeing the German army in the spring of 1940. In an article from Le Monde in July 1962, a reporter wrote, quote, "The bundles of linen piling up on the sidewalks, the cars with roofs laden with mattresses, the military trucks hastily transforming into moving vans, Oran, Algeria, represents certain images of June 1940. For France's Jews, of course, the war encompassed not only dislocation and flight, but also persecution and genocide. Of the 330,000 Jews living in metropolitan France at the end of 1940, nearly 80,000 were deported to their deaths or murdered in France itself, a figure that represents 24% of the total population. While the survival rate of Jews in France was one of the highest in Europe, the Vichy regime's level of collaboration was also remarkably high. Indeed, French officials at times went even above and beyond the requests made of them by German authorities. Many Jews, furthermore, blamed Jewish organizations in France for working too closely with the Vichy government and the German occupiers in an ultimately futile attempt to operate within the ever-narrowing legal space afforded for Jewish aid and relief. For a while, in this article, the plight of Algeria's Jews represented an opportunity for redemption for those Jews who had done too little to help their co-religionists during the war. The past that your conscience refuses to face, whose responsibility you deny, whose accusing voice you refuse to hear, has returned. In his editorial, he insisted that the entire Jewish community of France must commit both financially and emotionally to supporting their Algerian co-religionists, in particular to supporting Jewish children who face both immediate and long-term danger in Algeria. The immediate as well as long-term fate of thousands of children who could have been your own, he writes, is at stake. The history of the Jewish community of Alsace from 1939 to 1962 provides a particularly striking case study of how the experience of displacement and persecution during World War II shaped Jewish officials, community leaders, and individuals' responses to the Algerian War some 2 decades later. Just as they had sounded the alarm about the risks posed by Nazi Germany's militarism and anti-Semitism, Alsatian Jews were some of the earliest voices warning of an imminent humanitarian crisis in the waning days of the Algerian War. In both instances, community leaders proved willing to act unilaterally when the government and national organizations failed to step up to the crisis. And during both the Second World War and the Algerian War, Joseph Weil and others like him focused much of their attention on the most vulnerable population, protecting and rescuing Jewish children. Today, France is home to the third largest Jewish population in the world, and it is also the only country in continental Europe whose Jewish population in 2019 is larger than it was in 1939. The majority of this Jewish population traces its origins back to North Africa and the exodus of Jews at the end of the Algerian War. At the same time, Alsace has long been a center of Jewish life, not only in France, but in Western Europe as a whole. My lecture today thus represents one way to conceptualize the historical linkages between these two important communities. Just a bit of geography, in case some of you aren't up on your French regional locations. Nestled between the Vosges Mountains and the Rhine River, Alsace has been a major center of Jewish life dating back to the Middle Ages. Until the early 19th century, the region was home to the largest Jewish population in France, and many Jewish communities in other parts of the country were founded by Alsatian migrants. Many of the most prominent French Jewish figures, from Alfred Dreyfus to Prime Minister Léon Blum, were either born in Alsace or came from families of Alsatian origin. Alsace's location and history provided a vantage point for its residents to perceive the Nazi threat more clearly than other parts of the country. The region had been part of Germany from 1871 to 1918, and most adult residents still spoke German to some extent. Residents of Strasbourg, Alsace's largest city, heard Adolf Hitler's speeches directly on the radio and read Mein Kampf in its original German years before it was translated into French in 1934. The Jewish Times, the region's largest Jewish newspaper and predecessor to the Bulletin de nos Communautés, routinely published articles about Jewish persecution in the Third Reich, adopting a far stronger editorial line than Paris-based publications. Following Hitler's ascent to power in 1833, Strasbourg's location on the French-German border on the Rhine River made it an entry point for Jewish refugees from Germany and Eastern Europe. As Meredith Scott Weaver showed in her work, local Jewish organizations exhibited considerable autonomy in their efforts to aid asylum seekers, deploying networks of social and political associations to help these refugees, even when national Jewish organizations in Paris were ineffective. The onset of war in 1939 was also felt much more immediately in Alsace than in the interior, as Alsatians often refer to the rest of France. While traditional histories will typically characterize the first several months of World War II as a phony war, a time of relative inaction, the situation was actually quite different on the Franco-German border. French military planning was infamously reliant on the Maginot Line, a series of defensive forts designed to deter German incursion into Alsace. Many of the region's residents, however, lived on the wrong side of these fortifications. Immediately after the declaration of war on September 1st, 1939, then, French authorities evacuated all civilians living within 12 miles of the German border. Between September 2nd and September 3rd, 374,000 Alsatians, a full third of the population, were evacuated to southern France in one of the 20th century's largest and most ambitious planned relocations. This evacuated sector included Strasbourg, whose 180,000 inhabitants, 10,000 of them Jews, were given only a few hours to prepare for their departure and limited to 30 kilograms of baggage each. And here you can see what Strasbourg looked like. On one hand, we have the famous Place du Quai Vert, surrounded by sandbags in case of German attacks, and we have the evacuation of the synagogue of Strasbourg, bringing out to take with them to southwest France. Jewish leaders reacted to this preemptive evacuation with the same initiative that had characterized their response to the influx of German refugees in the early 1930s. In December 1939, a group of Alsatian Jews who had been involved in social and charitable projects during the interwar period, including Joseph Weil, the social workers Fanny Schwab and Laura Weil. Weil is a very common name in Alsace, no relation, and the architect Lucien Crombach, founded the Œuvre d'aide sociale israélite, or the Israelite Social Aid Program, to provide services to displaced Jews from Alsace and neighboring Lorraine. With the evacuation of the residents of the Franco-German border occurring before the fighting had begun, the German invasion triggered another massive influx of refugees to the southwest. In June 1940, some 350,000 Alsatians fled their homes, joining the 8 million other French, Belgian, Dutch, and Luxembourgish citizens on the road. A cresting wave of humanity of a scale heretofore seen in human history. This is the comparison that was made in 1962. Although the armistice of June 22, 1940, never officially surrendered and transferred sovereignty of Alsace and neighboring Lorraine to Germany, German authorities followed a policy of de facto annexation almost as soon as they arrived. Part of this new administration meant reshaping the reconquered territories along racial lines. Heavy pressure was exerted on the Vichy government to encourage the repatriation of Alsatian evacuees and refugees that lived in the unoccupied and occupied zones of France, but only those who met Nazi racial requirements. Official policy prohibited the repatriation of anyone besides those of German descent. All others, including Jews, were prohibited from crossing the line between the unoccupied and occupied zones. On July 14, 1940, all remaining Jews were expelled from the region, and Alsace was declared Judenfrei, officially removed of all Jews. Thus, by the summer of 1940, an estimated 29,000 Jews from Alsace and from neighboring Lorraine were living in southwestern France. Their circumstances were relatively unique. As French citizens, they received state assistance, but given the German interdiction on Jews, it was unlikely that they were likely to return home at any point in the foreseeable future. On this map, you can see the two main centers of Alsatian Jewish life that developed in southwest France. One in the city of Périgueux, under Rabbi René Hauschler, the Grand Rabbi of the Bas-Rhin department, and the other in Limoges, under Rabbi Abraham Deutsch of Bischheim. Displaced from their homes with no clear timetable for returning, Alsatian Jews worked to reconstitute the fabric of their everyday life in exile, despite the increasingly dire circumstances. Prior to the war, both of these cities had only very small Jewish populations, and the influx of Alsatians necessitated an expansion of everything from worship spaces and Jewish-oriented businesses to the creation of Limoges' first kosher butcher and its first matzah factory, which began operations in 1941. These institutions testified to the resilience of Alsatian Jewish life, even under the most difficult of circumstances. The early establishment of the OASI had created a foundation for expanding services as the displaced Alsatian population expanded. Members of the organization traveled through unoccupied France, providing material aid to refugees. Their work was supported by the Joint, beginning in June 1940, who also provided funds to supplement the government's official refugee allowance. In recognition of the indefinite nature of the community's dislocation, the Joint also financed the creation of a children's home for Alsatian refugees, as well as helping to establish old age homes and provide medical care. Joseph Weil, whom we met before, worked with the OSI and also played a major role in the rescue of Jewish children as persecution increased. A diabetologist by training who worked extensively with children, Weil served from 1940 to 1942 as the medical director for l'Œuvre de Secours aux Enfants, or the Children's Aid Society of Vichy France. Through his work, he traveled to the various internment camps holding Jews throughout the unoccupied zone, where foreign Jews were being kept, attempting to provide a basic standard of care while also passing along eyewitness testimony to his superiors in Geneva. Weil would go on to publish a first-hand account of these camps in 1946, providing important documentation of the Holocaust as it was experienced within France. At first, he pushed to have children moved from the camps and placed in Jewish children's homes. By mid-1942, however, he realized that living collectively in homes made them easy targets for deportation. Through his advocacy, a clandestine network was established to remove the children and place them in families throughout the countryside or smuggle them out of France entirely. Weil acted as go-between for those hidden children, procuring extra ration cards and papers for those who were eventually able to leave the country. Many of those involved in the OSC's operations were also from Alsace, where their ability to speak German proved an advantage in avoiding detection. In total, the OSC and its networks of hidden children is credited with rescuing 5,000 Jewish children. Throughout this time, Weil was in close communication with the Joint, particularly with Sally Meyer, the Joint's European representative. He crossed the border multiple times in order to give direct reports about the situation in France. In August 1942, he smuggled eyewitness reports from France's internment camps, as well as photographs taken from inside Paris's Velodrome d'Hiver stadium in July 1942, when it served as a detention center for more than 13,000 foreign Jews round up in Paris. Members of the Joint recognized the integral role played by Dr. Weil during the war. Herbert Patsky, who came to know Weil while serving in Marseille as the secretary of the Joint's European Executive Council, recalled in an oral history decades later, one of the prime movers at the time, one of the real activists in the OSC was Dr. Joseph Weil. He was from Alsace, and when the Alsatian and Lorraine, Jews were expelled and were settled in the Dordogne in southwestern France, he came down with the lot. In the beginning, he was up in the Dordogne with the rest, but he very soon came down to Marseille and worked with the OSC. He traveled in and out of camps. He was a real dynamo, a man of courage, a man who was not afraid to say what he had on his mind and provided very good leadership, not only in matters dealing with the OSC, but in general what could be done for the Jews. Weil stayed in France until April 1943, when, alerted by friends of an imminent Gestapo raid on his home in Terrasson, where he was officially registered with the government as a Jew, he and his family fled to Switzerland, where they worked to maintain the Joint's funding for the OSC's clandestine network until the liberation. In total, approximately 10% of the Jewish population of Alsace perished in the Holocaust, a number that is again lower than the overall percentage for France in general. After the war, many of the individuals who had played roles in protecting and maintaining the Alsatian Jewish community rose to positions of prominence within the local community. Rabbi Abraham Deutsch, who played a pivotal role in establishing the Strasbourg community exile in Limoges, became the Grand Rabbi of the Bas-Rhin department, a position that he continued to serve in until 1970. As mentioned previously, Joseph Weil was elected president of the Bas-Rhin Consistency, the local Jewish governing board. Several others who served as social workers reaching out to isolated Alsatian refugees or who helped hide Jewish children with the OSC would also play important roles in the years to come. Now, moving forward a bit to discuss how the strategies pursued during this time period affected choices made in the wake of the Algerian crisis. In order to appreciate the response of the Jewish community of Alsace to the exodus of Algerian Jews in 1962, it's important to understand the circumstances that precipitated their flight. The eventual departure of Algerian Jews was by no means a foregone conclusion at the outset of the Algerian War in 1954. After all, while French rule in Algeria had only begun in 1830, the Algerian Jewish community dated back to antiquity. Some trace their roots as far as the Jewish traders who arrived with the ancient Phoenicians in the 19th century BCE. Others descended from Iberian Jews fleeing Spain after the 1492 Edict of Granada, or Italian Jewish merchants connected to the trans-Mediterranean trade networks in Livorno, or Bedouins in the Sahara who had converted over the centuries. Among this disparate community, the single most fundamental transformation occurred in 1870, when the Crémieux Decree granted French citizenship to nearly all Algerian Jews. With a single stroke of the pen, Algeria's Jewish community gained full legal and political equality that was at that moment denied to Algerian Muslims and would remain to be so until the dying days of French Algeria, creating a schism between the two communities. During the Algerian War, the FLN made repeated entreaties to Algeria's Jewish community, encouraging them to join the nationalist struggle and help build a multi-confessional independent Algeria. In particular, the FLN sought to influence Jews by reminding them of how they had been treated during the Second World War under the Vichy regime, subjected to discriminatory laws, and their citizenship revoked with the abrogation of the Crémieux Decree. In fact, some Algerian Jews did support the nationalist cause, particularly those from a communist political tradition. Over the course of the war, however, the escalating violence enacted by the FLN against civilians led many Algerian Jews to believe that their community was being specifically targeted. Events such as the December 1960 desecration of the Grand Synagogue of Algiers, the effects of which you can see here, and the targeting of Jewish neighborhoods by terrorist attacks gave rise to the feeling that there would be no place for Jews in an independent Algeria. Some Jews would go as far as to end up joining the Organisation Armée Secrète, or OAS, the secret armed organization, a paramilitary group of Algerian settlers who engaged in terrorist attacks against French government and Algerian Muslims target alike in an attempt to prevent Algerian independence. Most, however, took their place among the more than 1 million so-called Algerian repatriates, migrating to a country where their ancestors had never actually lived. Although the flow of departures began in 1961, the pace of migration picked up substantially between May and August 1962, with 500,000 people leaving Algeria during these months alone. It is hard to overstate the lack of planning on the part of the French government for this phenomenon. Far from predicting the influx of arrivals, French officials seemed incapable of recognizing the crisis as it unfolded. In May 1962, for example, a briefing on the unusually high number of passengers on ships from Algeria to France was explained away as the annual flow of holidaymakers. Even at the high point of the migration in July, French officials still struggled to understand its scope. A report in that month that purported to lay out recommendations for accommodating rapatriés in various realms, housing, employment, professional retraining, etc., assumed that 355,000 people would arrive in France over the next 3 years. Again, that number ended up being more than 1 million. National Jewish organizations likewise largely failed to predict the scope of the crisis. The Front Social Juif Unifié, or FSJU, an umbrella organization of Jewish social and community organizations created along the American model in 1951, for example, predicted the arrival of approximately 25,000 to 30,000 Jewish refugees. A January 1962 report by the European Office of the Joint, North African Jews on the Move, gave a slightly closer estimate of 50,000 individuals in 1962, of whom they predicted 80% would move to France, with the rest migrating to Israel. In the end, the number of Algerian Jews who moved in 1962 to 65 was only 5%, with the remaining 95% of the 140,000 who departed heading to France. Compared with other parts of France, though, Alsace was not actually a major destination for Algerian Jews or Algerian rapatriés in general. A government report from early 1963 estimated that of the 110,000 Algerian Jews who had arrived so far, only 1.3% had settled in the Bas-Rhin, one of the two districts of Alsace, around 1,500 individuals. Local accounts roughly accord with this figure, suggesting that approximately 500 Algerian Jewish families settled in Strasbourg, with a few scattered in smaller communities throughout the region. Meanwhile, nearly 40,000 Algerian Jews settled in Paris alone, and southern cities such as Marseille, Lyon, and Toulouse also saw dramatic increases in their Jewish populations. Although Alsace did not experience an overwhelming influx of Jewish repatriés, the local Jewish community distinguished itself by its prescient, proactive response to the crisis. Whereas the French government and national Jewish organizations were caught largely flat-footed by the massive flight of Algerians, European and Jewish residents, local Jewish leaders in Alsace had planned for exactly that, such an eventuality. You can see here. Official discussions about the possible arrival of large numbers of Algerian Jews began in Strasbourg in 1961. The notes from the 26 March meeting of the Consistoire, the Jewish consistory of Berlin, indicate, quote, "We must be prepared for the departure of an enormous mass of North African Jews towards the metropole. It is a great mass of small artisans, farmers, small merchants that we will have to welcome, and it will be not enough to just give a single offering, no matter how large it is. All our fellow Jews must be in solidarity with these refugees. We must find them lodgings and a job." In December of that year, Grand Rabbi Abraham Deutsch, whom we've met previously, published an article in the Bulletin de nos Communautés forewarning his congregation of the eventual need to help their displaced Algerian co-religionists. Quote, "When the time comes, large-scale action will be necessary, and it is not a bad thing if people are ready for it," he wrote. While not yet specifically requesting donations to a particular cause, he encouraged people to increase their donations to the community in general. Events happen suddenly, and it would be unfortunate if we did not have sufficient funds to address the most urgent needs. Rabbi Deutsch framed his charitable appeal in terms of memories of the war. "So let us be ready, let us be understanding, let us be generous. It has not been so long since we ourselves knew the sad fate of the refugee. Today, when Providence has allowed us to exist each under his own vine and the shadow of his fig tree, it does not cost us much to give to others what we were happy to receive ourselves." That fall, Deutsch and other Jewish leaders also began to lay down the institutional response. In October, Joseph Weil established a working committee with the stated goal of, quote, "centralizing the study of the problems and possible solutions posed by the current or future arrival of North African Jewish refugees in France." This committee, the announcement of which you can see, drew its membership from across the rich tapestry of local Jewish religious and social institutions. The consistory and the Alsatian Jewish, the Strasbourg Jewish Institution, the Akiba School, the city's Jewish school, the local branches of the Universal Israelite Alliance, the FSJU, representatives from the public authorities and education system, as well as various youth-oriented charities. In January 1962, the Comité d'accueil des Repatriés d'Algérie de Bas-Rhin, or the Bas-Rhin Welcome Committee for Algerian returnees, was formally created. The plurality of institutions represented in this planning process reflected the extent to which the Second World War had helped foster connections between the various Jewish religious communities within Strasbourg and Alsace as a whole. Historically, significant differences existed between followers of the Alsatian rite and newer arrivals who had brought their own traditions with them from Eastern Europe. During the 1930s, the influx of Eastern European Jewish refugees had provided an impetus for the Polish and Alsatian Jewish communities, for example, to begin to work together. In Limoges and Périgueux, during their exile in southwestern France, this impetus only became more pronounced. The Jewish community in exile in both cities represented an amalgam of stakeholders, compelled by circumstance into closer cooperation than ever before. 2 decades later, these different groups would all participate in the resettlement of Jewish repatriés through this welcoming committee. Another element of the Alsatian response to the Algerian crisis in 1962, in which the legacy of the Second World War is apparent, is in its focus on youth. In developing plans to help Algerian Jews, local leaders in Strasbourg devoted much of their attention to the plight of Algerian children. As a historical center of education, both Jewish and otherwise, Strasbourg boasted not only one of the biggest universities in the country, but also an ORT boarding school and one of the only 3 Jewish comprehensives in the country, the École Ekiba. By the beginning of 1962, the city was already home to approximately 200 North African Jewish students, living either in student dorms or local residences. Many of the most influential and famous members of the Alsatian Jewish community involved themselves in aiding Algerian Jewish children. In particular, we can look to André Neher, the noted scholar and writer, and his wife, Renée Orena. Deeply concerned with rebuilding not only Jewish institutional, but also spiritual life in the wake of the Holocaust, Neher saw in the arrival of Algerian Jews the potential for a spiritual regeneration of French Jewry. Upon visiting Algeria in 1954 with his wife, Neher described being deeply moved by, quote, the intensity of Jewish life there. Above all, what we discovered in North Africa was the Jewish people as a mass, he said. In France, there are only individuals. The community of Strasbourg was one of the only that could truly be called a community. And even then, there's no comparison between the 25,000 Jews in the city of Bonn in Algeria, or the 70,000 of Tunis. The idea that Algerian Jews, especially the youth, might fully integrate into France and become assimilated into secular life was alarming from this perspective. Additionally, we can see the influence of Lena, Neher's wife, her experience in the rescue of Jewish children during the Second World War, during which she helped to find both places for Jewish children to hide, and also worked to get them out of France. In the winter of 1961-62, the Nehers discussed the situation in Algeria regularly with Rabbi Abba Hazan, the army chaplain for French forces stationed in the city. Born in Algeria himself, Hazan had previously worked at an Alliance Universelle Israélite school, a Jewish school in Morocco, and he had already begun forging links between the newly arrived Sephardic Jews and their Alsatian co-religionists. In September 1961, for example, he held Rosh Hashanah Sephardic rite services for North African refugee families in the youth chapel of Strasbourg's Peace Synagogue. Through the urging of Hazan and the Nehers, the Welcoming Committee moved in March 1962 to enact Aide aux jeunes Israélites repliés d'Algérie, or Aid to Young Jewish Displaced Algerian Israelites, or AJIRA, a special project designed to evacuate Jewish children from Algeria to Strasbourg. In addition to removing these children from harm's way, their absence would allow their parents to pack up their belongings and make arrangements for their own travel to France at a later time. Once in France, the families could find housing and jobs, while the children would be cared for by the local community. On behalf of the Welcome Committee, Hazan wrote a letter to each of the 60 Jewish communities in Algeria, inviting parents to send their children to Strasbourg. You adults cannot leave Algeria, but your children can, he said. We will receive them with the help of God and the community. We have a full-time Jewish school and other institutions. Do it before the bloodshed takes the lives of your children. These efforts in 1962 to help Algerian Jews reflect the same willingness to take the initiative when larger bodies failed to do so that Alsace's Jews had showed during the Second World War. The Algeria Plan was an entirely unilateral project by the Bahan Committee, and actually prompted concerns within the national offices of the FJSU that parents of children who were not in danger might also send them to France, breaking up families and diluting the remaining Algerian Jewish population. In Strasbourg, however, the impulse to help largely overrode questions of the proper hierarchy of aid. Thus, in 1962, a special local meeting of local institutions called by Joseph Weil, Neher confidently stated, "We can only count on ourselves and must consider the national SJU in Paris, as well as the public authorities, as mere auxiliaries." At first, the committee received no response to their offer. With the upsurge in departures from Algeria in May and June, however, children began to arrive in Strasbourg. The first group, composed of 37 Jewish boys and girls, came from the Algerian city of Mostaganem on June 11th. The local newspaper, the Dernière Nouvelle d'Alsace, reported on their arrival. As the children's train from Marseille pulled into the station, an impressive assortment of local officials were there to meet them. The president of the local French North African Association, the Secretary General of the Berlin Department, a representative of the mayor, and others. The children were taken to Strasbourg's Jewish Community Center, which had recently transferred into a centre d'accueil, or a welcoming center, where they received a medical examination, as well as what the newspaper promised was an excellent lunch in their honor. In the coming weeks and months, the region would house approximately 400 children. The influx quickly outstripped the offers to host them. Entire families began arriving as well, providing further challenges for the committee, which was loath to separate children from their parents. With the summer closures of schools and the departures of many residents on holidays, these Algerian Jews were at risk of being left isolated, particularly those who were resettled in other parts of the region. The summer holidays, however, also allowed the community to tap into the local infrastructure in new ways. Jewish summer camps throughout Alsace opened their doors to Algerian children, as did empty Jewish dormitories in the city of Strasbourg. School cafeterias opened daily to serve Jewish rapatriés. In the Alsatian town of Hagenau, Neyer officially negotiated for the temporary usage of both an orphanage as well as a local high school, which served as a dormitory. A welcome center opened there in July 1962, served the needs of nearly 120 youths. Throughout this network of accommodations, local volunteers have attempted to provide not only shelter, but also support within a specifically Jewish framework. Remedial courses were organized to help fill in the gaps that the war had left in children's secular as well as religious schooling. At the Welcome Center in Hagenau, for example, children spent the mornings studying in French, English, and mathematics, while afternoons were devoted to leisure with games and organized trips. Neher used his considerable influence to recruit young Jewish scholars from the university to serve as instructors. By the end of the summer of 1962, the parents of most of these children being cared for had resettled elsewhere in France, allowing them families to be reunited. Approximately 100 children remain separated from their families, however, spending the year as boarding students, living at the Young People's Dormitory while enrolled in the École Akiba, which added 3 additional classes to accommodate the new students. Remedial courses continued throughout the year and expanded to include non-Jewish Algerian children who also needed educational assistance after their education had been disrupted by the war. Another particular area that distinguished the relief efforts of Strasbourg's Jewish community was its reception of several hundred Mosaic Jews, referred to at the time often as oasis or desert Jews. This community hailed from the southern Algerian region of the Mazab, where they had been far less affected by French colonization than Jews living in the coastal regions of Algeria. The Clemenceau Decree of 1870 had never actually applied to these groups, meaning that they did not receive French citizenship until 1961, and were therefore not eligible for things such as French jobs and education in French public schools. Thanks largely to the involvement of a colonial administrator who was himself Alsatian, the majority of this community settled in the area surrounding Strasbourg. You can see here a picture of this community first came to American attention during joint efforts in the Second World War, and large numbers of these Jews were also settled in Israel. As the acute problems of accommodation or resettlement gradually gave way to long-term questions of integration and social cohesion, differences between Alsatian and Roosevelt Jews would linger for decades to come. There was overall a sense that Alsatian Jews looked down upon the Sephardi Jews of the Mazab, and that their traditions weren't respected in the same way. Generally speaking, the Joint was highly supportive of initiatives taken by the Jews of Strasbourg and Alsace as a whole. A January 1963 report by Stanley Abramovich in the Geneva Offered singled out, quote, the special effort made by the community of Strasbourg in taking upon themselves to house and educate Algerian Jewish children. At an April 1963 meeting of the Joint's department heads, Lois Hackett, a writer for the Joint's magazine Exchange, remarked upon the city's, quote, rather exceptional effort in the way of receiving Algerians the previous summer. The people in Strasbourg, she told her colleagues, had anticipated the emergency that was going to happen rather better than other people in France, and had started planning a campaign for it as early as last January. In particular, the community's prodigious fundraising stood out at a time when, as a July 1963 joint report stated, quote, the French Jewish community on its own is in no position to meet this problem, the problem of Algerian refugees. In its budget submissions, the Berlin Committee, Welcome Committee for Algerian Returnees, promised to raise 220,000 francs of its 500,000 franc budget for the 1963 fiscal year, and it did so. In her work on the activities of the American Jewish organizations in post-war France, Maud Mandel has described the task of the Joint and other institutions as not just helping French Jewish institutions to rebuild, but also reform themselves, or along what might be called American lines. More consistent fundraising, more cooperation and communication between historically separate Jewish groups in France. The work done by the Jewish community of Alsace to prepare for and help facilitate the arrival of Algerian Jews in the region exhibited many of the same characteristics that American Jewish organizations sought to foster in their French counterparts. The genesis of these reforms, however, lay not in the post-war period, but rather in the strategies of survival and solidarity that Alsatian Jews developed during the war itself. In June 1963, the Joint's Public Relations Committee published an article by Lois Hackett describing a recent trip to Strasbourg. Hackett spoke with various members of the community about the challenges and opportunities facing the Algerian arrivals. One unnamed man, however, perhaps best expressed the spirit that animated the Alsatian response to Algerian Jewish refugees in 1962. All of us in Strasbourg know what it means to be refugees.
Don't go away. I hope you've all enjoyed the program, and now we're going to ask Laura to entertain questions. I'm sure there are plenty.
And please wait for the mic.
Hi, great lecture. Thanks very much, Laura. You described that the Alsatian Jews left upon maybe hours or a day or two notice, presumably leaving property. Now, after the war, I believe the figure you gave was only 1% of Alsatian Jews returned to Alsace. Why such a low figure? Especially since many of them probably had property there which they might have tried to reclaim after the war.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. Actually, almost all Alsatian Jews did return. The statistic was that it's difficult to gauge figures for the effects of the Holocaust in France. For various reasons, the difficulty of obtaining religious statistics in France means that it's any of the assumptions, the statistics that I've given about how many Jews live in any part of France at any given time are often not exact, but we think that around 10% of Alsatian Jews perished. The majority of them do return back. However, you're absolutely correct that they are without access to their belongings, to their resources. This is one of the reasons that the Joint becomes involved with this community in the first place. Groups such as the OASI, this relief organization that Alsatian Jews created for themselves, had difficulties because their funds were in banks in Strasbourg. And after July 1940, the banks would no longer do business with Jews, especially Jews who are not, French Jews. So this was a problem. The Claims Commission was actually very active in Alsace, and a lot of the community was rebuilt. The historic synagogue of Strasbourg is one. It's beautiful. It's the synagogue. It's called the Synagogue Peace Synagogue right now, and it was rebuilt partially as a result of the lot of work that the Claims Commission did in post-war Alsace to reclaim possessions. So, thank you.
In the very first slide that you showed with the newsletter, there were 2 streets that were listed that had Jewish names, Rue Silverman and Rue Kuhn, K-U-H-N. Do they still have those names? Or with all the anti-Semitism that's now going on in France, are they still there, names like that?
That's an excellent question. I'm not exactly sure about those 2 streets in particular. I can say that throughout Alsace there are a lot of street names named after major figures. So, there'll be like a Rue Bloom after, probably William Bloom. I couldn't tell you about those streets in particular. Interestingly, once the de facto annexation of Alsace and the land took place in 1940, one of the things that the Nazis did was actually rename a lot of Alsace. And in that case, it wasn't just to get rid of Jews. It was anytime, there was a a street with a French name, they immediately changed it to German. But that's actually sort of part of the longer history of language policy in Alsace. But it's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I'm curious as to how large the Jewish community is at the present day in Alsace.
That is a great question. As I said, it's kind of hard to tell how many people there are, how many Jews there are in France at all. There's, with the exception of the Vichy regime, there aren't really official statistics by religion in France. It's also why we don't know how many Muslims there are in France. It is considered, an invasion and a violation of the separation of church and state to even ask that question. The last I heard, I think probably the population is around what it was in 1939. It's probably around 30,000. But again, it's one of the shortcomings of doing work. Yeah.
I just looked up on Google and both of those streets are still there.
Yeah.
3 cheers for the internet.
Yeah.
Next time I'm there, I shall search for them.
I was just curious about something, a couple of things actually, they're sort of related. Wasn't there, first of all, why didn't a lot of the Algerian Jews want to settle in the south of France, where there were already established Jewish communities that went back, quite a ways? And wasn't there a lot of pushback from the non-Jewish community of Strasbourg when all these children were being brought in to the fold?
Great question. First, I will say that yes, absolutely, the majority of Algerian Jews, rapatriés, do settle in the south of France.
They do.
Yeah. This is actually a small minority. But actually, a lot of times, what would happen is that these southern communities, which we're not just dealing with Jewish Algerians, but with Piedmont in general, would be, they would say like, oh, we're full, you can't resettle here, and so people would wind up there. We do have it though that some Algerian Jews wanted to go to Strasbourg. There's a great story of a young man who said that in the town that they were from, they always had sauerkraut, they had these sort of there was a Jewish kind of grocer, and all the things said made in Strasbourg. So when they decided where they were going to go in France, they said, well, we got to go there. That's where all the great food is. But yeah, in general, this is a small minority. As for your second question, I would say that again, it's important to consider this in the context of the larger upheaval happening. So in particular, the children are probably a small number of the people who are coming from Algeria at the time into even Alsace and Strasbourg. So it probably was not as much of an issue. And again, there is a sense that the Jewish community of Alsace treated these groups differently. They specifically sought out to help Algerian Jews, but the French government, because again, there is no distinction between religion, these were all just Algerians. And so, for example,
that's right.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so if a representative of the mayor was coming, it wasn't because they were Jews, it was because, these are our French, they're our children.
Thank you. I just have a question about the time before the war.
Yes.
Is there any knowledge of how many Jews fled to the French side from the German side, which had of course been French for a long time, for instance from Saint-Louis, from those towns that are right across?
Yeah.
Does one have any idea how many fled while they still could into Alsace?
Actually, there's a really interesting study that's being done about the responses in the 1930s, because generally speaking, the French Jewish authorities in Paris, like the Consistoire Centrale, were not especially quick, fast-acting to help refugee communities trying to come into France after 1933. However, in Strasbourg, there was much more of an effort. Unfortunately, this is a time of, rampant, not only anti-Semitism, but really rampant xenophobia in France. So the arrival of refugees into Alsace was a real sort of concern. And actually the numbers, they no longer accepted refugees after 1934. So I'm not exactly sure about the numbers, but I do know that it was significant enough that they sort of put a stop to it. And at the same time, you have Jewish communities still trying to help anyway, you know.
So in Israel, you see you have a significant community from Morocco, from Tunisia. I've never come across Algerians in Israel, and how come that migration didn't follow the same as the North African countries?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, that's sort of what I alluded to, that you can think about these people as being, you know, why? You know, that there is this huge exodus of Jews from Arab states and from Muslim majority countries in this time period. I think there are a significant number of Jews of Moroccan descent in France now, but you're right that it doesn't happen the other way. And largely the difference is that Jews in Algeria were French citizens. And so they had the right as repatriates to move to France. And whereas in Tunisia and Morocco, they didn't have that same citizenship status. And so if you wanted to, you know, if you didn't have anywhere to go, if you went back to France, you know, you spoke French at this time, you know, you could, a lot of places, they would, especially if you were if you worked for the government, they would try and help you find a job in France. And so there's a real move in that way that's based on this kind of political and legal equality that Algerian Jews had enjoyed with the period of exception of the war for 90 years. Yeah.
Do you have any idea what the Jewish population today is in Strasbourg? I happened to have been there about 3 years ago, and there were huge numbers of Muslim women and children in the streets in the central part of the city. And I wondered, frankly, what the Jewish population is.
Yeah, as I said, I'm not entirely sure. I would say probably, I wouldn't want to guess, but I would say that it is still a very vibrant community. There's still, there are actually now multiple synagogues. There's a separate Sephardi synagogue. The Jewish community center is very well attended. In Alsace, as opposed to in the rest of France, there actually isn't a separation of church and state as far as religion. So Jewish schools in Alsace throughout this time period receive state funding. So that's one way in which the kind of community has remained remarkably sort of vibrant. Yeah.
I have a question, if I may. I wondered about French Jews going to Algeria during World War II. Were the Alsatian Jews mostly safe in the Dordogne and they stayed there? Were there Jews from other parts of France who fled to Algeria? What was their reception by the Algerian Jewish community?
Excellent. The part of the separate chapter that I wasn't able to present on today. Yes, there was absolutely a movement of not just Alsatian Jews or French Jews, but European Jews to North Africa during this time period. Those of you who remember Casablanca, the opening scene has, I thought about putting it in, but I didn't really have time. It shows the map and it shows people from Marseille to Oran and then Oran to Casablanca, and then they want to get to Lisbon, but they get stuck. A lot of people didn't just get stuck in Casablanca, they got stuck in Oran. So absolutely there are refugees in North Africa. That's actually how American organizations like the Joint first became involved in North Africa, because traditionally it wasn't a place where there was much joint involvement, but with this refugees who are trying to get out of Europe, that's how they sort of get there in the first place. As far as Alsatian Jews, they're definitely there. It has become a sort of a challenge, but an exciting one for me to figure out exactly how many there are. We know that there are enough that the Ministère des Cultes, the religious ministry, allows the sending of an Alsatian rabbi to practice there. And in North Africa, while they're subject to discriminatory laws, while Algerian Jews are stripped of their citizenship, there aren't, with the exception of people in internment camps in North Africa, people are not being deported from North Africa to Drancy and to Auschwitz. So it was a place of sort of somewhat greater safety. So they're definitely there. But, yeah.
And the local Algerian Jewish community welcome them, help them?
I mean, yeah, they do help them. That's another part of my dissertation, is that there are actually, the connections between these two communities actually stretch back into the 19th century. So you see, after French sort of authorities established in Algeria, the establishment of a consistorial system based on French lines, the idea that we need to sort of take these Algerian Jews and regenerate them, make them modern. And a lot of the people who worked as teachers in Jewish schools, who served as rabbis in Algeria, were in fact Alsatians. So there's a lot of back and forth there. There are a lot of intermarriages. So, but great question.
Yes.
I was struck by the high number of survival. 90% in World War II survived the Germans. Can you summarize what they did to achieve that? Thank God.
Yeah. I don't have any sort of official statistic about this, but based on my understanding of the situation, I can give it a shot. First of all, the fact that they're all in the southwest of France is very helpful. There are different rates of deportation from the occupied zone and from the unoccupied zone. And because basically all Alsatian Jews had been expelled to the unoccupied zone by July of 1940, they're not going to be caught up in, say, the Belgian Roundup. They're not going to be directly under German authority until 1942. Another part of this would be that they do have these organizations, that there has been a sort of creation of mutual communities of support that exists during the war that allows people, like when Joseph Weil finds out that the Gestapo is coming to his house, he's able to get out. I would also say, and this is a bit more difficult to quantify, but the fact that Alsatian Jews are from Alsace plays a role. As you may know, the overall statistic of Jews in France who survived the Holocaust is around 75%, but that number is very different if you look at French Jews versus Jews from other parts of Europe who had moved there before 1939. In that case, I think it becomes half of all foreign Jews eventually are deported. And so not only are Alsatian Jews French Jews, but they're also from Alsace. And Alsace has this sort of patriotic image in French minds. The fact that the Germans don't actually annex Alsace is because Pétain and Vichy is like, we can't let you have Alsace again. They've already fought 2 wars over it. It will be a very bad look for Vichy if they give up this mythical province. And so you actually see that the refugee support for Alsatian Jews in France does not stop. They're still getting refugee subventions until October 1943. So this is almost a year after the invasion of Germany in the Free Zone. So I think these are some of the factors that I would say.
Thank you so much, Lauren. We are very grateful. I think everyone enjoyed this. We don't usually get this many questions, so that's an indication of how successful your talk was. Thank you all for coming. I hope you've enjoyed our program today, and I'm sure you did, because I certainly did. And I'd like to draw your attention to some of the printed material on the registration table about our names index and our website. Please take a look at our volume, I Live, Send Help, 100 Years of Jewish History in Images from the JDC Archives. It's a great gift. I've given it to many, many people, and I think they would really appreciate it as the holiday season is coming up. Please sign up for our JDC Archives newsletter and for future events, and keep in touch with us on our JDC Archives Facebook page. Thank you all for coming. And I just have to say one thing. Linda, I'm going to ask you to say something. Jeff, you around with the mic? Take it to Linda. When I first came on the JDC board, I was a co-chair of the North African Committee. And I remember that we had one woman left in Algeria. And I remember we had a nun that we were sending money to because you had found her, and she was taking care of this last Jewish person in Algeria. Would you like to comment on that? Just say one sentence.
Sure. I think as somebody who worked in JDC at that time, and Jane as a leader, what struck us was that the joint tries to become involved in major Jewish crises around the world, but it doesn't forget the one Jew who is left. And that particular story was vividly described in a report from Evelyn Peters, who was our country director at the time for Algeria, but she lived in Paris and could not, for security reasons, travel to Algeria. So her was all through connections of people, and through that she was able to find this nun who provided the help to this last woman who, if my memory is correct, her name was Fifi. But I'm not
sure.
I only saw the figures, I didn't see the name, but it struck me so that we would take care of the one last surviving Jew in the country. Thank you all.